It's great to be with you here in Victoria. I was going to say sunny Victoria, but from Perth. And I was going to say it's hard being a bad guy in Australia, but I think it's hard being a bad guy specifically in Victoria, given the things I've read in the paper. But it's great to be with you. What I'm going to do the next 3 days, just over the sessions, is give you a 30,000 foot flyover of where we're at culturally as Christians, I think, or the West is at, and looking at what does it feel like, or how do we get to be here? That's the first thing I'm going to look at. So I wrote this book called Being the Bad Guys. You may have seen it. How to Live for Jesus in a World That Says You Shouldn't. And somehow the title was pretty catchy because it caught the zeitgeist of how people felt. That I have worked for most of my adult life in a church setting where when I first went into ministry, going into ministry was taking a hit for the team. And now it feels like getting up on Monday morning and going to work at Ernst & Young is taking a hit for the team Christianly because it's a much more complex world. And what I experienced was people coming to me saying, being a Christian isn't that easy to go into the workplace and evangelize because something about what we say is actually quite transgressive to our culture. And we've noticed that. So what I want to do today is look at where that came from. How do we get here? And then tomorrow I want to do, what does it feel like? What does it feel like to be the bad guy? What's in the air and the tone of it? And why is that like that? And on the third day, that sounds like something biblical, doesn't it? On the third day, we're just going to look at where might we go from here? Because I think there's a couple of directions that our Western nations in particular could go. There's a lot of options out there. Will we become more Christian in 50 years' time? Will we be less Christian? Will Christianity be something we don't think about? Will we be bad guys still? So that's what we're going to look at over the next couple of days. And we will have questions, and that's great. So I was going to get everyone to move forward by saying I'm only taking questions from these chairs that are reddish coloured, but, I'll take questions from the back as well. But if you can keep them to questions, that would be great. So I call questions sheep and I call statements goats. That's just a visceral way of explaining how emotionally you might feel about the questions and statements. But first I thought I'd start with a scary story, a scary real story. Anyone remember this? Now, when I've used this illustration in Queensland, they say, what? Well, there's another code of football other than rugby league, but there is indeed. Does anyone remember David Koch on Sunrise interviewing Victoria's own Guy Mason about Andrew Thorburn in the middle, who was Chief Executive Officer of Essendon Football Club for how many days? 1 day. 1 day. And the great sin, if you're allowed to use that term of anything these days, was that Andrew Thorburn was the chair, still is I think, of Guy Mason's church. And the great sin of Guy Mason's church was that they dredged up from about 12 years ago sermons of Guy Mason's and in his church around issues of sexuality and gender and abortion and things like that. And the question was asked, how can Andrew Thorburn be the chief executive of a football club which is about diversity and representing everyone in the community when he holds to sort of dinosaur views around gender, sexuality, and end and start of life and all those things. And Andrew Thorburn thought that he could do that given that he had been the Chief Executive Officer of the National Australia Bank and rolled out its diversity program. But it doesn't take many years for things to change and to heat up, and that's exactly what happened. So Kochie had Guy on the Sunrise Show. Now, Guy had been on the Sunrise Show a few years ago when their church first started as the church that meets in a pub, and that was all very hip and urban and amazing, and it was kind of like he got there's journalism, there's exposing President Nixon for the crook that he is, and there's puff pieces. And he got the puff piece of, here's a funky church that believes stuff, but they meet in a pub a few years ago. Not this time. Not this time. Now, I texted Guy the day before to say, praying for you, I hope it goes okay. And he texted back, thanks, and, I think he's got some media training, so I think that was going to be okay. And then this. Did anyone watch it? Do you know how I watched it? Like I used to watch Doctor Who when I was a kid. When the music came on, I'd get behind the couch, like that, over the top and look. And it was a bit of a shredding. David Koch went, I think they switched out the questions. Guy had been anticipating a set of questions that they just switched out. And he hammered him, absolutely hammered him. And Tim Keller was one of the last things he wrote about Australian situation was on this issue last year, not long before he died. He wrote about this situation and how you would address where we're going culturally because of what happened. And Koch's main question to Guy was, how can you Christians say that you're this and that and the other? Look at how can Andrew Thorburn be the chief executive officer when your church is this unreconstructed dinosaur act of homophobia and bigotry? And Guy's first line was, well, Jesus is all about life and love, which is absolutely brilliant for your vision statement for church at the start of the year. And David Koch just sort of drove a truck through that. How can you say that? How can you? And how could you represent? And he asked this hard question: how can Andrew Thorburn represent people in an organisation when he is implacably opposed to how they would live their lives? And it felt like filling a sock full of 1-cent coins and smacking them over the back of the head with it. It was quite brutal. And then you read the comments online and all the things that happened, and sure enough, that's what happened. After a day, out of the job, and that was it. Now, there is a good side to that story, which we'll come to in a minute, but it says, how did we get here? That's the question I'd been asking in the book I wrote a few years ago, Being the Bad Guys. How did we get here? How did we get to the situation that when I was young, as a young teenager at school, being a Christian I got outed at school. And being outed at school was you went to church. And it was like, shame, because you're lame. Now to be outed at school as a Christian is you kind of might be dangerous. You might be unreconstructed in your thinking and a bit of a bigot. And kids are a little bit more careful of that. Now, my daughter is studying literature and medieval history at Notre Dame University. And the young Christian guy who sits next to her in one of her classes is super keen and found out that I wrote this book, Being the Bad Guys, and he wanted to tell the whole class in her literature class that her dad was the author of this book. And that would have been disastrous for her in some respects. Being the bad guys, how to live for Jesus in a world that says you shouldn't. So there's been a push that Australia was never really a Christian country per se. The percentages of people that went to church was fairly low. Has been. But the idea that you went to church sort of made you, if not a good guy, at least, you can be trusted a little bit, or you're a bit lame because you're a wowser. And things have shifted dramatically to the point that Guy Mason is getting hauled over the coals by David Koch, and someone keeps their job for a day. Now, that's not jackboot, brown shirt persecution. Let's just name that. But something is going on in the cultural moment that people are looking at Christians and going, you can't really represent other people because of what you believe, and it's transgressive. Now, I took the term being the bad guys from the movie Falling Down, which is a great movie about a guy called William Foster, who ostensibly starts the day off as a good guy and ends up the day standing on Venice Pier Beach with the sun going down and the police pointing guns at him like this. And the main police officer is played by Robert Duvall, and Robert Duvall says, "Come in, William, I've got some nice police officers here who want to talk to you. They're good guys." And the look of discombobulation on his face was, "You mean I'm the bad guy? How did that happen?" And I think that's part of the problem we're facing culturally at the moment as Christians is, how did that happen? We turned our backs, got on with doing church, popped our heads up a few decades later, and suddenly we're the bad guys. And how do we deal with that? And we want to run around in our culture and tell people, look, everyone gets a share to say what they want in the culture. So everyone gets to believe what they want because that's the kind of place we live in, you do you. So why can't Andrew Thorburn be the chief executive officer of the football club and still hold to those views? But his views are viewed as beyond the pale. They're dangerous and transgressive and they damage people. Welcome to church. And so many people that I know that are younger are saying they're a bit worried about bringing a friend who's not a Christian to church in case something is said that just blows everything up out of the water. Around issues that 20, 30 years ago we just assumed that people believe that Christians have different views on these things. At the same time, we're living in a context where people are divided very strongly, politically, culturally, all those sorts of things, that the person on the opposite side isn't just wrong, but they're evil or bad. So we haven't, at the same time that religion is kind of dissipating from the public square, religious hot language about evil and good and all those things have popped up in our political cultural spheres. And we have these people shouting matches over the top where most of us are keeping our heads down in the middle. But there's this public square where it's very hostile being a Christian. Now, that's not always the same in your life. You might have friends who are not Christians who go, oh, those Christians, they're terrible. And you go, I'm standing here, you know. And you go, oh, not you. You're fine. Whew, you know. But there's that context which there's a very hot media conversation going on about what Christians believe and how they think. And people read that and go, that's what Christians are like. But then there's this, what I call this two-speed economy. The chug, chug, chug of everyday Christian life, living among your friends, and that seems okay. And somehow we have got to find a way to be able to explain those hot-button topic issues to people who've no clue about what we believe and couldn't see why we would believe it anyway. And then you go to university and you're keeping your head down as a Christian often because of these sorts of things, or the HR department at work. So that's the context, I think, that many Christians find themselves in. And perhaps we see it in our big cities more than we see it in our smaller settings. But you're certainly going to see it in Sydney and Melbourne in a way that perhaps you won't see it in one of a regional town, for example. But it feels that way. And so what I want to do is really explain how do we get there a little bit. And I'm really splitting this into a game of two halves where I'll talk for 45 minutes and then you'll ask statements, you'll ask questions at the end of that. And we'll riff on that for 45 minutes. And that'll open it up for tomorrow's session. Well, there's a great book by Carl Trueman called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. Has anyone got that book? Now, I want less hands now when I say, has anyone finished that book? Yeah. It's a tough book to read, actually. The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. He's got a Cheats Notes version of it, by the way, if you need, called Strange Days. Buy that and read that. But I want to read a statement that Carl Trueman makes about where we're at in our Western culture. Carl Trueman is an English guy who lives in the US now. He's a history buff, and so he lectures in church history. But he says this, and there are a few bigger quotes in this passage in the things I'm going to say today, but I'll read them all. The intuitive moral structure of our modern social imaginary prioritises victimhood, sees selfhood in psychological terms, regards traditional sexual codes as oppressive and life-denying. Oh, we just lost it. Can we get that back? Any chance? I'll keep reading it. And places a premium on the individual's rights to define his or her own existence. I feel like I'm at a rock concert and I'm not as well toned as I thought I was. But anyway. No. Let's try this again. No. Yeah, that's right. From over there, up there. Isn't it? It's gone, is it? Well, I'll explain it anyway. The intuitive moral structure of our modern social imaginary, says Carl Trueman, prioritises victimhood. Now, what does he mean by the intuitive moral structure of our social modern imaginary? I mean, do you say that line every day before breakfast? I do, you know. 3 times at least, my kids are going, intuitive moral structure. It simply means the water we swim in. What's believable? What's possible to believe? The intuitive moral structure of our modern social imaginary. The way that our modern society has been put together that says this is believable, this is public square information that we take for granted, and this isn't. And this is stuff that we don't believe. But the water we swim in our culture prioritises victimhood, he says. And what Carl Trueman means by it prioritises victimhood, he says, is that the voices that were oppressed or suppressed in the past are now highlighted. So minority groups in our culture, which were oppressed, now their voice is amplified because it's a reparations issue in that sense. Now, it's true that there are victims in our culture and that the church has made a few victims along the line. But what it's saying is you can't, as Christians today, go, hey, we're being persecuted, we're victims too. We're being told to shut up. He's saying, no. The culture is saying, you had your time. You had your voice, and it was loud. And if you think you're a victim, look how much money's put into Christian schools. Look how much money is, go to Sydney and you stand next to Town Hall. The building next to Town Hall is St Andrew's Cathedral. Power has been in your hands, and you haven't used it well. You've oppressed people. You've kept down voices that should have been heard, and you've raised your own voice to drown those out. Now it's time to switch that around. Now, you may go, oh, it's terrible. I'm just telling you what it is in that sense, what's going on. The next one is really interesting. The intuitive moral structure of our modern social imaginary sees selfhood in psychological terms. That's absolutely critical to understanding the modern Western world. Now, my wife is a clinical psychologist. And 50 years ago, even 40 years ago, if someone came to a clinical psychologist or a psychiatrist and said, I feel like my physiology, this hunk of manliness you see before you, does not line up with my psychology. I feel like I am a woman trapped inside the body of a man. That's just a simple case, that's just a simple explanation. So here you are, here's your psychology and here's your physiology. And the role of the clinician was to help you better align your psychology with your physiology, line you up again. Which way does it go now? It's the other way, direction. And you see that in all of the papers that come through. My wife's reading clinical papers, and it's saying that you must go in that direction. You must go in that direction upon, pain of being reported. You must affirm that. And that's a big shift. We live in what's a psychological age. It's a therapeutic psychological age. And our modern social imaginary says, whoever you think you are, that is who you are. Now, this has even moved on fairly quickly in the last 6 or 7 years, because Bruce Jenner, 1976 gold medalist in the decathlon at the Montreal Olympics, sort of man of the year on all the cereal boxes, 2015, woman of the year. The same person was able to loose the surly bonds of their physicality and become who they truly thought they were in the same lifetime, and is celebrated for both achievements. And then you go to Wikipedia page on Bruce Jenner, and the idea that Bruce Jenner was a man competing in the Olympics has sort of disappeared down the memory hole. The social imaginary aligns, not just Bruce Jenner, but the whole social imaginary shifts as well. And that's partly because we're psychological selves. But even then, you don't have to spend a lot of time and money and scientific effort to align your physiology with your psychology any longer. You can just make the claim, this is who I think I am. And anyone who says otherwise is doing psychological damage to you, which is why words in our current setting are so contested, because words are the true violence in a psychological age. Now, the subtitle of the book is The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, Cultural Amnesia, Expressive Individualism and the Road to Sexual Revolution. But I'm going to suggest to you, and this is probably where there's a little bit of a chink in the armour. It should read The Rise and Failure of the Modern Self, because the triumph of the modern self is being propped up by a lot of high caps Medicare money. Psychology in Australia is booked out. You can say what you like about the sexual revolution, but it's built us a great house in Perth down by the river, I tell you that. I say that facetiously, but my wife is booked out 6 months in advance. It's just that way. We live in an anxious age that if this is who I am, and I truly know that, and everyone should affirm that, how come it doesn't feel like it's working? I'm pulling the lever, but it doesn't work the way I hope it does. And we put a lot of time and energy into sorting that out in people's lives. The next thing it says, the intuitive moral structure of our modern social imaginary regards traditional sexual codes as oppressive and life-denying. And that's just 200 years of French philosophy, which I'm going to bore you with for the next... No, I'm not going to do that at all. That Genesis 1, we're talking about this morning, Genesis 2, those passages of the Bible are actually oppressive to what it means for people to fully express themselves. Rousseau, man is born free but everywhere finds himself, what? In chains. And you may not be able to quote Rousseau, but you know every Disney movie and your kids sing, grandkids sing Frozen more than they sing Colin Buchanan songs. And it's baked into that idea that the point of your life is to express yourself to the world the way you wish to. And religion and church are two of those chains that compress you and contract you and stop you being who you truly are. So what you get is when someone actually expresses themselves the way they wish to be, Bruce Jenner to Caitlyn Jenner, it's a salvation story. Once I was lost in manliness. I haven't quite lost myself in manliness yet, but I'll do a few weights, I'll get there. But now I've been found. Once I was blind to what true liberty looked like. Now I can see. The irony is that as we become a more secular age, we just take the language of religion and keep it to ourselves and use it for our own personal salvation stories. But it also places a premium on the individual's rights to define his or her own existence. That's absolutely critical to life in the West. That's the you do you stuff. The way you most express yourself is to look inside who you truly are and then show that to the world. And anyone who denies that in you, or any institution that says you can't do that, is oppressive and life-denying. Hello, church. That's part of the issue that we're struggling with. How do we navigate that space? How do we say, Jesus is all about life and love, and David Koch goes, no, you're not. You're stopping people being about their lives, and you're stopping them expressing true love. How can Jesus be about life and love? Now, there were gaps in his arguments, which we'll talk about later, and you could have driven a truck through them, but we will talk about those later. I'm just trying to get the zeitgeist, so to speak. I wish there were a German word for zeitgeist, but I haven't found it yet. But anyway. There's a great book by Dale Kuhn, Sex and the I World. And the minute I say the word I world, you just know what that means, don't you? That individual world. And he contrasts the T world, the traditional world that has been not just Christian and not just Western, and certainly not Western now, but many places around the world. Just, talking over lunch about Chinese Malay culture and how you look after your parents when they're old and grumpy and, like I'm going to be at some stage, and how we have a much more individualistic way of looking at things. But the I world is the world that we're in this individual world, and the traditional world, Christianity sort of chugged alongside it pretty well. It worked quite well. Most of the time. Because you could fall under the wheels of the traditional world if you didn't fit the bill. If you were a single mum, if you were divorced, if you were same-sex attracted, all those things, if you didn't have a community. And the traditional world at its best formed great communities. Every time I get into an Uber to go to the airport and there's a Sikh or a Muslim Uber driver, the first thing they say to me is, I love your beard. Of course, this old thing, And the second thing they do, they want to know what you do, and then they start asking questions about church and religion and why Australians aren't religious and why these Australians work too hard and they don't do community very well and they don't look after their parents. And you go, oh yeah, I live in the I world. The T world isn't in the past, it's just somewhere else overseas. Though a lot of the T world is coming to us. So you've got this clash even in our secular places, like Australia, where there's a lot of T world people and a lot of I world people. But Dale Kuhn says, personal relational choice is replacing the T world's relational matrix as the preferred path to human freedom and fulfillment. The T world is being replaced by the I world. And the central line in the T world about relationships were relationships of mutual obligation. You were in a system and a network in which your relationship web was held together with all of these have-tos and all of these oughts and all of these vows and covenants and ways of relating to each other. It was T-World that said, you make sense of yourself within the context of this community with these obligations. And you could break those at cost. You'd become ostracized from the community. You would be someone who was shunned or someone who just felt lonely because you didn't fit that anymore. You could break it at cost. But that was the framework. And the I world, it isn't that. To break a T world relationship in order to enter the I world now is seen as a thing of celebration culturally. Huge, massive issue. So to break a vow, a marriage vow, to live with your same-sex partner is expressing yourself to the world. And for someone to say that's wrong is doing damage to your human flourishing. And then you can see how that goes. So if you'd broken your vow here in the T world, you'd be very lonely. But if you break your vow in the I world or decide to go, there's a whole celebratory world over here that will look after you and affirm you. And that isn't just about sex, that's just about everything, how we do relationships. I don't think we've realised how much that T world has changed. But I also say this to us, that we're part of the I world a little bit as well. We don't think we are, but we are, and I'll explain that a little bit later too. But personal relational choice versus relational obligation, they're oil and water at one level. And that's one of the big changes we're experiencing in our cultural moment. Now, I thought I'd go highbrow. I've mentioned a few lowbrow writers at this point, and we go to a highbrow philosopher poet of America, Taylor Swift. You laugh, but it's true. Taylor Swift gave the commencement address at New York University in 2022. Now, the commencement address is it isn't at the start of the year, it's you commencing into life at your graduation. So all these graduates of 2022 at New York University, one of the best universities in the world, with the brightest people living in the safest place in the world, with the most money, this is Taylor Swift. And she says this, how do I give advice to this many people about their life choices? I won't. Scary news is, you're on your own now. Cool news is, you're on your own now. You can almost hear her singing it, but I won't try to do that. But and you read the rest of you can go online and look at the transcript of her full. It's brilliantly put together. Mentions all her ex-boyfriends. No, that's her songs, yeah. And in it, what you get is this. Life is really hard. Everyone's probably out to get you. Carve your own path. Be who you want to be. And you go, wow. I was born in 1967. And I reckon if you gave that kind of commencement address at New York University in 1967, you'd be laughed off campus. Because in 1967, the kind of commencement service address you were getting was, reach for the stars. And 2 years later, well, that's what they did, right? The average age of a NASA engineer in 1969 when they landed on the moon was 26. The average 26-year-old today, failure to launch. No, that's harsh, you know. But what Taylor Swift is saying is, the I world is the way it is. And every song she writes and everything she says backs that up. And that's why they had her at the commencement address. Because it's not like she's not picking up where people are at. She knows exactly how people think. That's why she sells a truckload of albums every day. That's the world we live in. And baked into that is an insecurity that it is cool to be on my own in the I world, but at the same time, if it's all on me, yay, guess what? It's all on me. Who do you blame when you fail? You. At the same time, there's great opportunity in the I world. Line up to get a session at a clinician because of the anxiety in our cultural moment. My wife said that we were watching the delayed Tokyo Olympics during 2021, and it was a particularly exciting race that I really wanted to watch, so she decided to talk about psychology and said, that's harsh. She was watching the race too. I think it might have been Rowan Browning running the 100 metres, so my daughter was particularly interested in watching that race. And she said, anxiety is the gold medal, on the gold medal place on the podium of mental health, far above anything else at the moment in Australia. And that was, she said, she saw it coming before COVID and it exacerbated during COVID. And part of that's around this, I'm on my own now, I've lost these opportunities and I'm trying to carve out who I'm supposed to be, and no one's given me any frameworks for that. At least in the T world, you referenced yourself off against everyone else. Who am I? I'm a mother, I'm a daughter, whatever it was. You could build a network of this. But over here, it's you get to decide that and carve that out individually for yourself. Very different world. And in one sense, we are I-world people, though I will say this here carefully. Most of us haven't had arranged marriages, have we? Though I said that at a church where my friend Shabu was the pastor and I was staying with his parents, and they had an arranged marriage. How about that? They met 2 weeks before their engagement, which was arranged. They got married, and her hubby promptly left for 6 months' work somewhere else, and she had to live with her mother-in-law and sister-in-law. That's a scary story, right? 54 years together, still married, though. We just can't contemplate that how that relationships of mutual obligation said, this is the path you're going to go for your marriage, and it will be okay. No one here thinks that, though, do they, really? Because we still believe the Hallmark Disney version of how we do relationships. We just do. And why is so much of the issues that we're facing pressured? They're around relationships and covenant and the body. And often it's said, if you Christians could just dial down what you believed about all that stuff and just say nothing for about 20 years, it might sort out. You go, well, no one else is saying nothing about it. Our young people in our churches are being discipled by something, so it has to be by us, surely, because the discipleship program of the world is on point. How do we do it? But this whole idea of the I world and relationships of personal choice makes same-sex marriage actually inevitable. This is inevitable that in 2017 we should vote for that. Because most people are going, their default isn't, well, marriage is a covenant relationship, but marriage is like all other romantic relationships, somewhere to find sexual fulfillment and partnered for life with someone who completes you. There's no vertical relationship to marriage anymore. That's been cut in a secular age. Though more of that later, actually. But that's not just cultural. The thing we're probably struggling with the most is that it moves into the legislative area for us as Christians, and you have to navigate that space because Justice Kennedy of the Supreme Court makes this statement: marriage responds to the universal fear that a lonely person might call out to find no one there. It offers the hope of companionship and understanding and assurance that while both still live, there will be someone to care for the other. That's a very different definition of marriage to one I think we've been brought up in the church. A lonely person might call out to find no one there. Really interesting statement about marriage. And what you find is that the pressure isn't just, I did an arts degree in the 80s and I thought these ideas will never fly. They're crazy ideas. All this postmodern literature stuff I was reading. Next minute, because anyone who's writing and making films and advertising in 1980s at university, they're the storytellers of the next generation. The things that I assumed would stay in the university setting in the 80s are now commonplace understandings of how we do life now. And you can be assured that whatever we're studying now at university will be commonplace ideas culturally. And so what you get is legislation has now started to play catch up with the culture, which is why you get toughened legislations for Christian schools, for example, how that all works. That can Christian schools employ Christian staff who can teach a different moral ethic and still be funded by the state to do so? Why is the battleground in Christian schools? Because they're so formative of people, young people in particular. And Jill, my wife, will say that one of the issues with the trans conversation at the moment around transgender conversation is that it used to be, I think, that there were, people who are struggling with dysmorphia issues were a little bit older, a lot fewer, and they were navigated through that situation. And now what we're saying is that kids who are in transition places themselves, because teenagehood is transition time, let's just drive another whole transition issue up and park it there and saying this is actually could be a great path to your future. It's a very confusing time. So I would say as the church, what you can't do is just go, well, you can't do that because it's not right, or someone's struggling with it and you isolate them. You can't do that. But we have to pitch a better vision of what it means to be human. To not just live in the T world, but to live in a gospel world where we have relationships of mutual obligation, not based on just what the community says, but on what Jesus says, on being part of the body. We've got a bit of repair work to do, I think, in the church in the next 30 to 40 years if we're going to be able to counter some of the things that are happening. But it is coming through in our legislations, perhaps more so in Victoria, though Western Australia is certainly taking on a lot of the issues that Victoria... I like to think with a Costco Victoria in Western Australia, some of the same issues. But in my book, Being the Bad Guys, there was a doctor, David McAlpine, who struggled and then refused to use the pronouns of a tall, bearded man who said that their pronouns were she and her. And he was brought before a disciplinary committee, medical disciplinary, and he thought, I've got a safe bedrock here. I've got Genesis 1 and 2, and I'm a Christian, and I can hold those things. And surely human rights came from a Christian perspective of value, dignity, and worth. And this was the response. This was the response from the committee that was disciplining him. Belief in Genesis 1:27, lack of belief in transgenderism, and conscientious objection to transgenderism, in our judgment, are incompatible with human dignity and conflict with the fundamental rights of others, specifically here transgender individuals. So what David McAlpine had thought was, well, I can show how the Christian framework is really the basis of all Western understandings of human rights, and I can trundle out the Genesis 1 and 2 human rights thing and say, see, you Westerners, you think you know everything, but you got all of your human rights from the Christian framework, so be grateful. And what they said was, Genesis 1 is actually not proof of human rights, but it's actually destroying human rights. It kind of changes the whole rules of the game. Now, at this point, you might want to go out and grab a pitchfork and, four-wheel drive but we don't have to get too angry about it at the moment, because I think we've got to think through how these processes work. And so, David McAlpine's fundamental right to say, no, I don't affirm that, came in contrast with the fundamental right of someone to say, you must, and he lost every time, at every level. Now, there's a little bit of a swing back against that, which we'll go into later. But that's what's going on culturally at the moment. I think that's a major issue in our cultural moment. And I think it's a salvation issue in the sense that our culture is so Western, our Western culture is so Christian, even though it doesn't realise it. And it's got a whole idea of where very soon, there's a great future coming, which is a very Christian idea. And somehow we're heading towards that. There's a world that's going to be better. And you Christians are just going to have to fade away a little bit and let everyone be who they want to be. But the idea that the world is going to head towards some great future is actually a very Christian idea. It's not a progressive idea per se. Because the Roman world didn't think that. The Greek Roman world that Jesus came into said that the golden age was behind us, of the gods and the heroes. An Eastern view of the world is very cyclical. It's not going towards a better future. Christianity, because of the resurrection and the return of Jesus, is pitching a future that's going to be... And if you take Jesus and the resurrection out of that, people still instinctively in the West think there's a better future coming, but they just don't know what to attach it to. That's part of the problem. That's why it's a salvation issue at the moment. It's a battle between two ideas of where the future's going. And Dale Kuhn says it, the T world and the I world embrace both freedom and fulfillment as essential aspects of the best life possible. The debate between them is how each of these is understood and achieved. They both have the same goal, your freedom and your fulfillment, except they're going in exactly the opposite directions to try and achieve that. And where did the Christian idea of true fulfillment come from? The great irony is that Jesus said anyone who wants to gain their life must lose it. And that's absolutely outside the remit of our Western framework at the moment. The Bible talks, Jesus never uses the word fulfillment after the word self in the Bible. He uses the word denial. But we look at self-denial in our culture, and the only place you can really do that is the gym, I think. Don't eat that. We're very, we've got lots of laws. It's not like we got rid of law. We're full of laws. But the battleground at the moment is definitely in what it means to be human, what it means to be embodied. And we're living in a world where I think that the transgender debate is just a stepping stone to the transhuman debate that technology is now allowing us to buy into. That technology is driving so much of this. And the same with the transgender. If you had the technology to shape your body the way you want it to be, you can do it. But the transhuman debate is that this thing is worthless. It lets us down. It's discriminated against. All the issues of race and gender and all those things will be done away with once we can upload who you psychologically are, which is your true self, into some sort of AI mainframe or whatever. That's the point. It's a very thin hope for the future that's disembodied. So you can start to see there are some chinks in the armour that we could drive a truck through eventually about what our hope could look like. Because that looks a very thin hope to me. Very thin indeed. But make no mistake, if you're going to be hated for something as a Christian in the next couple of decades, it's not going to be on the actual or spiritual presence of Christ in the communion elements. That was the Reformation. Trevin Wax says, today we're facing a third major crisis. He talks about the first crisis facing the church was it faced the Greek world that thought the body was yucky, and it's saying, no, Jesus is both fully God, fully man in one person. Today we're facing it, and then there was the Reformation, which had this, how do I get right with God? Is it through the sacramental issues that the church gives to me, mediated to me, or is it through, by the power of the Holy Spirit, by grace through faith? He said, today we're facing a third major crisis. This time the focus is on anthropology, the nature and destiny of humankind. What's a human being? What does it mean to be made in God's image, to be created male and female? Do we receive our identity and purpose, or do we create identity and meaning for ourselves? That's the primary question. That's, in one sense, the T world, whatever it said, even if it wasn't Christian, said, we're giving you an identity and purpose. And then you strip that all away for the I world, and it says, no. Your job is to create one. Yeah, we go to the scriptures and we see that it's very different to that. We are receiving one. So it's not just what is a human, that's me, but not even what is a human for, but who is a human for. is a human for you, which makes consent the lowest bar possible that you need to jump when you do something else with another human. Do you see how that works? Or are you made for someone else? Those are the two issues we're facing. Now, most people aren't thinking in that category. Most people aren't thinking, the moral structure of our social imaginary. They're not thinking like that. But how are we thinking? Well, here's a good way to look at it. We'll go to some questions. This is a great campaign during the 2016 census. Not religious anymore. Mark no religion on the 2016 census. And in 2021, did the same thing. In both those censi, sounds like, is that a bad of your censi? 900,000 people who hadn't ticked it before ticked it. In 2011, remember the scary days in 2011 when you actually had to be in the location where you were filling the census with actual paper and pencil? But this is all online in 2016 and 17. And what was happening there? Because see, Rory Shiner puts this really well because he looked at that and he said, not religious anymore is different to not religious. Because not religious is a statement, but not religious anymore is a story. Do you remember that time you were religious? Do you? You had to wear itchy pants to church and sit in a pew and it was, miss out on sport on Sunday. Well, guess what? To be a good person, you don't need to do that anymore. You don't have to be. In fact, look at your kids. They're grown up with, kids of their own and you're a great-grandparent and it's fantastic and they're good and they've never darkened the door of a church. In fact, they didn't even get married in a church. You don't need to be religious anymore to be good in our current culture. You don't need to default tick. Like, Madge would be sitting in 2011 at the table. Hey, Harold, what religion are we? AKA, which church do we never go to? And Calathumpian. She'd tick Calathumpian or whatever she ticked. And that was it. But in 2016, you could mark not religious, not because you were going to church the week before and singing love songs to Jesus and taking up the collection, but just because it wasn't anything to you anymore. And it wasn't transgressive saying you weren't religious. It was emancipating. And 900,000 people did it. So the nominals all fell away. And then another 900,000 in 2021. Now, why is that important? Why should we care about that issue? Because what's the census data used for? It's used to determine where government puts money. And the No Religion campaign was very clear that we do not need to be funding organisations that A, are not representative of the average population anymore, and are, in fact, also transgressive of the things we believe in our culture. That's the issue we're dealing with. So, shameless plug for next book, Future Proof. The census data is showing less religious adherence. People are starting to ask why, for example, governments are funding faith-based schools that have discriminatory staffing practices, only hiring Christians. That's a key issue in our culture. Why is that such a blow-up topic all the time? Why does every government that gets in try to find a way to say Christians have to hire, can't have discrimination policies with their staff? Because of these issues. They know that this is a critical place of formation. The Christian schools are what I call alternate ethical communities. They're places where you cross over the line of the Christian school and it feels like a different social imaginary. And guess who's coming to our Christian schools in droves? Non-Christians. Why? Because they've pulled the lever of the I world or watched it and it's broken off in their hands and they're going, what's going on here? There's something a bit crazy going on here. These are the tensions we're dealing with, even though we're the bad guys. And that's, I think, stepping forward, that in 2026, I presume the census data will fall further again, probably by another 900,000 people, just the way it's going. At the moment, it looks like we're not the future. That's what it looks like. At the same time, that you can't get booked in to see a clinical psychologist in Australia for 6 months. So whatever's replacing the framework of the T world It hasn't got up to speed yet. And some of the issues we're dealing with are meaning and purpose issues in our culture. It's one thing to have everything, it's another thing to know why and what to do with it, the meaningless aspect of it. Now, I said I would give plenty of time for questions, and I'm going to do that because we've got 40 minutes, and I could talk, well, I'm Northern Irish. I could talk forever. And if you want to fight, I'm ready to start now, Northern Irish. I don't know if any of you know who the Reverend Ian Paisley was in Northern Ireland. My mum and dad were married by him and I was dedicated by him, so how about that? Yeah. I've had therapy, doesn't matter, it's okay. Bizarre, huh? My little claim to fame. But these are issues that people are asking all the time, is how do we get to this situation and what are we going to actually do about it? Big issues for Christians. Now, in different places, it affects different generations. It affects different education standards and socio-economic issues as well. But the undercurrent is very strongly that this is the I world, not the T world in one respect. And we don't get to just hide behind the T world as Christians and motor along. We're getting exposed in the same way that Guy Mason got exposed on David Kosh's show. Huge issues.